a huge warm welcome to all of you, and always enjoy the opportunity to talk to people about some of this work that I've been involved in. And it's been almost 30 years now that I've been working with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So I thought I'd just start a little bit with my story about how I became involved with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So my story begins in 1994, and I was doing my clinical psychology internship at UBC. And near the end of my internship year, a job posting went up, and they were looking for someone to join a team in Toronto to help out with conducting the first trial of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to see if it would be helpful for reducing the risk of depressive relapse. And up until that point in my career, I'd sort of appreciated the benefits for some of my clients of being present at times. It seems that it was helpful for them. And also, when I was more present, the sessions seemed to unfold in a different way. It had a different flavor to it. But there were two things that I didn't know, and that was whether using a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy approach could actually be helpful in reducing the risk of depressive relapse or for just mental health problems in general. And I also had no systematic way of teaching people how to become more present. So this job offered me the opportunity to address both of those issues. And I leapt at the opportunity. I went for a year. I stayed for 11 in Toronto before coming back here to Vancouver in 2006. And in that time in Toronto, I learned how to deliver the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy groups from one of the treatment developers, Zindel Siegel, and also got a chance to, work with the other two treatment developers, John Teasdale and Mark Williams. And also started training others in how to deliver the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy groups and did some research. And then when I came out to BC, in part, it was to help increase access to cognitive behavior therapy in the public sector, which was an interesting mandate. I was part of a team that helped establish Bounce Back, Reclaim Your Health, which is a free low-intensity CBT program out there offered through Canadian Mental Health Association. Just put a little plug in for them, but also continue to do, lead these groups and do research and train others in this modality. So that's what I've been up to. And in addition to doing this work, as professionally, we also develop our own practice, with the mindfulness, the meditation practice. So, and that's an important part of the teaching as well. So let's begin. Nice to see some faces and on some of the screens. So my first question, or not my first question, yeah, I guess my question, is just to take a moment and check in. Where is your attention now? So some of you may be paying attention to me, but some of you may find that your mind had wandered maybe to other things, like what you're going to have for dinner later, maybe some events that happened earlier in the day. And sometimes when people meet me for the first time, they think this guy's last name is Lau. I was expecting him to look a little different. Always goes over better in an in-person kind of event. But just for what's worth, my parents were Dutch, and so that's where I got the name. And so there you go. But more importantly, what we just did there was just turning inwards, checking on where our mind was. And that's just a little bit of what we're doing when we're practicing meditation. And so the next place, we get to know a little bit about where our mind goes, where our attention goes. And but the next place that your mind might go is, why would I care where my mind goes? The first thing that we learn when we start to practice meditation, and you may already know this, is that our mind does tend to wander. And that's normal. A human mind is a wandering mind, and there's benefits to that. It allows us to learn new things, allows us to think, solve problems and to plan our futures, etc. But, and this is what I'm going to explain to you in a little bit, it can be an unhappy mind. Some of the places that it goes can cause us some trouble. And so there was a nice paper that came out many years ago now, and they concluded that the ability to think about what is not happening is a cognitive achievement that comes at an emotional cost. So let me illustrate that in the following way. What I'd like you to do is to invite you to just sit comfortably. We're not doing a meditation at this point, but you may or may not want to have your eyes closed. But I just want you to imagine the following scenario. So you're walking down the street one day. You see someone that you know well coming in the opposite direction. You're excited to see them. You smile, you wave, and they walk right by you and they don't acknowledge you. So you're walking down the street one day. You see someone that you know well coming in the opposite direction. You're excited to see them. You smile and you wave, and they walk right by without acknowledging you. What comes up for you? What's your reaction? Now, normally when I would do this exercise in an in-person group, I would sort of get some input, but I find that it's a little harder to do on the Zoom. So what I'll do is try and capture what are some common responses to this scenario. So quite often, there may be some people who might be kind of sad or depressed, and they might think, oh, that person doesn't like me. Maybe even nobody really likes me. Some people might be angry. They must have seen me. Fine, if that's how you feel, do what you want. Some people might be concerned. Wow, they must be really preoccupied with something that they didn't notice me. I hope everything's okay in their life. Others might be worried. Well, what's going on there? What did I do to upset them? Now, I don't know if that begins to capture some of the reactions that people had out there, but basically what I want to sort of get across is that ultimately we can get quite a range of responses for the same situation. So different emotional reactions and different sort of thoughts about those reactions that are sort of associated with it. And so this is where I would introduce what we would call the cognitive model in its most simplest form. And basically it says that in any situation, the meaning that we give to that situation, the interpretation, sometimes we use the term the automatic thoughts that arise in that situation, are associated with then how we end up feeling, how we behave, and our physical reactions. So we can take this example where someone's just walked by you, and we can even go forward a little bit, maybe 10 minutes down the road, both figuratively and literally, and ask, what might the person be doing then in terms of their behavior? So if someone was at risk for depression, it's not uncommon that maybe they thought, well, nobody likes me. I might as well just go back home and crawl into bed. Or they may have another reaction. They might still be thinking about this 10 minutes later, and it just might affect the rest of their day. So where your mind goes, in this case, to the meaning or the interpretation in this situation, or the automatic thoughts, if you would prefer to use that term, can have an impact on how we feel and how we behave. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay, so that's one way of illustrating where our mind goes is important. And so, with meditation, part of what we're doing is we get to know a little bit more about the habits of our mind, about our automatic thoughts, etc. And we can, instead of being carried away by them, we can maybe, with awareness, we can potentially respond a little differently in situations. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I do want to show you another slide which sort of captures another way of answering that question of where my mind goes. Is that helpful? And this is just, some of you may have seen this in the past, but basically the idea that your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. So even more important about where your mind goes. And so there's that. So we learn that we have a wandering mind, and that where it goes is important. And so in many ways, starting to tie this in a little bit to the challenge that was being faced by Mark Williams, John Teasdale, and Zindel Siegel, the treatment developers of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, was they face the challenges. How do we work with this wandering mind and so that we can help reduce the risk of depressive relapse? And so I think their challenge is captured quite nicely in this quote from William James, who was a psychologist, and it's 130 years ago now. He was quite astute. He said, "And the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical instructions for bringing it about." So we kind of identified the problem, but how to work with it took a little while before was introduced to sort of North American culture. And so the first introduction of maybe an answer to this challenge was put together by a guy named John Kabat-Zinn. And so he originally put together the first of the mindfulness-based interventions. His was called Mindfulness-based Stress Reduction. And he invented a group program to teach people these meditation skills in order to help people who had either chronic disease issues for which nothing more could be done medically, and they still had suffered from symptoms, and or chronic pain issues that couldn't be managed. And so he wanted to help improve their quality of life despite the fact that they had to continue to live with these problems. And so he developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, and it was first described in this book, Full Catastrophe Living, just a great title. And so in many ways, this was the sort of, when we think of Adam and Eve, this was sort of the Adam and Eve of mindfulness-based interventions for the next a little while. So this was first introduced, or this book came out in 1979. So quite some time ago, almost, I guess we're getting close to 40-ish years, 45 years. So this is 1979. Let's fast forward a little bit to the early 90s. And that's when the three treatment developers I was talking about took on the challenge of trying to reduce the risk of depressive relapse. We'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments. But what they did, essentially, they were a little, they went on this journey to develop the treatment, and the treatment they ended up developing borrowed a lot from mindfulness-based stress reduction, and maybe about 80%. And then they switched out some bits from the mindfulness-based stress reduction program and inserted some bits that were based more on cognitive therapy. And so that, I'll get to that in a second, but what's happened since 79, and this is more in the the 2000s and the 2010, is that mindfulness became very, very popular in the public in the public forum. And so started even to make it to the cover of Time magazine, not just once, but maybe twice, 6 years later. And this is my little plug for mindfulness. If you practice, you don't age, because she hasn't aged a bit over those 6 years. And there is some evidence actually that practicing mindfulness can help slow down some of the aging process in terms of, I won't get into the details right now, but anyway, so it became very, very popular. But getting back to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, the treatment manual for this program came out originally in the year 2000, and then the second edition came out in 2013. And we affectionately call this book the Green Book. And the developers put together some consumer books. The first one, the Green Book, is for the mental health professionals, but they've come up with the Mindful Way workbook, which is a really nice way of doing the group on your own, if you like, or doing the course on your own, if you like. And then more recently, Mark Williams, one of the three, came up with a new sort of a follow-on course called Deeper Mindfulness. And that just came out this year, actually. So that's just a little bit of a overview. So a little bit about what I wanted to cover today is just a little bit about, does this really work? If we go back almost 30 years when I started with this program, meditation was thought to be a little bit woo-woo still. And so is there any sort of science behind its benefits? And maybe you already know the answer to that, but and then answer a little bit of the question about why we would use training in mindfulness meditation to treat mood and anxiety disorders. And that will start to get into introducing the ideas of modes of doing and non-doing. And then we'll get a little bit more into an experiential sense of what mindfulness is. I do hope to sort of mix up the talking with a little bit of some exercises, and we'll see how far I get in terms of the timing with those. And let's just see what unfolds. So that's what we're going to talk about. So in terms of MBCT, the beginning of the story, I think it might be helpful to understand a little bit about why they developed it, and then because that can just maybe help you relate to it a little bit better. So I like this cartoon in terms of preventive medicine kills return business. And so in the early 90s, they were looking for ways to reduce the risk of depressive relapse. And in large part, it's because the risk of re-experiencing depression, if you've had one episode in the past, is quite high. It's about 50% if you've had one episode. If you've had 2 or more episodes, it starts getting up into 70 or 90, 70, 80, 90% chance risk of relapse. The more episodes you have, the more likely you are to have a relapse in your life. On average, people would experience about 4 episodes in a lifetime. So it's kind of like a common cold in that it's recurrent, obviously more severe than a common cold. But so this was the challenge that they were faced with. And so at the time, they had some very effective treatments for depression. Cognitive behavior therapy is one, interpersonal therapy is another. But they were still, so they could treat the acute episodes, but they didn't really have a way to sort of prevent it from coming back specifically. So what they did here was they sort of, to use a Vancouver analogy, they tore the house down and rebuilt. And so their first step was to come up with a kind of a theoretical understanding, like, can we come up with a vulnerability model for why people relapse? And so essentially what they came up with, and this built on some of the research that they had been doing, it really, if we distill it right down, it came down to the fact that when we get depressed, we have depressed mood, of course, and we've talked about the fact that along with that comes a lot of automatic thoughts that are negative in nature, and people probably can relate to this. And they tend to be negative about the self, others, or the future. And so can explain some of that hopelessness and just that self-critical aspect of depression. And so what they found was that when people recovered from the depression, their mood got better. They didn't have as many of those thoughts. But while they were depressed, those thoughts were sort of laying down little tracks in the mind, sort of deepening the ruts, so to speak. And so eventually it came down to, wow, it seems that if someone starts to experience a little bit of like sad or low mood, the degree to which those negative thinking patterns get reactivated will actually determine their risk of becoming depressed again. So if those thoughts get reactivated, it starts to contribute to the downward spiral of depressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And so that was one aspect. And then the other thing that they wanted to answer for themselves was, okay, we know cognitive therapy can treat depression. And it also can be helpful in terms of reducing the risk of relapse when we use it to treat the actual depressive episode. How does it do that? And so basically, they looked at some of the techniques that were used in cognitive behavior therapy. And one of them that's very common is using something called a thought record. And that's used to monitor what your automatic thoughts are, and then use that record to guide you through evaluating those thoughts. And in particular, any evidence that's inconsistent with those thoughts as a way of helping you feel better. And it is quite a helpful technique. But they were looking at this and they thought, we think the really helpful part of all that is when you write it down and dump it out of your brain, so to speak, onto paper, you get a little bit of a distance from it. And so they thought this skill actually taught the technique of decentering. And as life has gone on, this was back in the early 90s when they hypothesized this, but over time they've managed to kind of confirm that this is one of the key things that does help people reduce the risk of relapse, as well as even in terms of what happens in treating depression as well. And that was the results of one of the papers I published, I think, last year or the year before, that decentering was pretty key. So basically, they realized that they needed to sort of help people work with this activation of negative thinking that they experience in a low mood, and that part of the way to teach them this is to maybe teach them how to decenter from their thinking. There we go. So that led to the development of the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy program. And so then this is a slide really just to show you that there's lots of evidence that's sort of been reviewed over the years to sort of support the use of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in a variety of ways. The initial reviews didn't provide that strong support, in part because there weren't that many studies. But as time has gone on, in terms of MBCT for depressive relapse, pretty consistently finding that it's better than treatment as usual or placebo in terms of reducing the number of episodes or the time to your next depressive episode. And one of the more recent studies was done in 2021. So these are reviews or meta-analyses, which means they kind of take a whole bunch of studies, put them together, put all the data together, and then analyze all those data, and they can show that it is helpful. One of the more interesting studies was the one done in 2010 by a guy named Stefan Hoffman, and he actually wasn't a big fan of meditation. He did this study to actually demonstrate that it didn't work. So, which is good in terms of making sure that he was going to do a good evaluation of it. In the end, though, he did find from his meta-analytic analysis that and he didn't just do it for depressive relapse, he did it for anxiety disorders and treating depression. And what he found was that the mindfulness-based interventions like MBSR and MBCT were helpful for treating these disorders. And if you did have the disorder, they were even more helpful than if you just had some symptoms of depression and anxiety. So as of this, at least for me anyways, at that point, I started to broaden who I would include in my groups. This also include people with acute depression and acute anxiety. So for those of you who want to know that if it's important to know that it's an effective treatment, there's lots of data out there that would support its use. Just to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what it can be helpful for, as I mentioned, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was originally developed to reduce the risk of depressive relapse. So that's where it started. And as time went on, as they did additional studies, they started finding that some of the people in those studies had some residual symptoms of depression, which is one of the risk factors for relapsing in depression. And they also looked a little bit at people with suicidal ideation. That was one of Mark Williams' studies. And they found that it was also helpful there in terms of treating the residual symptoms. So kind of in a slow, gradual way, they started to increase or at least provide the treatment to people with increasingly severe levels of depression. And so then they started to treat acute depression, and there's a couple studies out there for treatment-resistant depression. Not a lot, but just a couple that suggested it might be helpful. There were some people who thought mindfulness-based cognitive therapy would be really helpful for bipolar disorder. And the reason here is that bipolar disorder, the risk of depressive relapse is even higher than in unipolar depression. So they thought it would be particularly appropriate for that. We did try to get funding from CIHR years ago at UBC to get a big study to conduct a big study to evaluate whether this is true or not. Unfortunately, we weren't successful, and I think it's still an open question. In terms of anxiety disorders, there's a range of anxiety disorders where these mindfulness-based interventions have been shown to be helpful. Generalized anxiety disorder, the tendency to worry about a lot of different things, health anxiety, panic disorder, and social anxiety disorder. And then over the last few years, a colleague has been working on using MBCT to treat PTSD. And I was the sort of the supervisor of the treatment provider for that study. And I think we're still waiting for some results there. Okay, so that's a little bit about just the empirical support. Tends to be helpful, and those are the, sort of the range of conditions that get treated by it. That's not an exhaustive, that's just in the mood and anxiety realm. Um, I wanted to just show you this slide because, or these next two slides, just because it's one finding that I really like. It's not specific to MBCT, it's more mindfulness in general. But what they did here is they took a bunch of people, experienced meditators on average about 9 years of meditation and maybe in the range of 40 minutes a day. And what they did is they looked at their brains compared to people who didn't meditate. And what I like about this study is that, I mean, quite often, the data that we look at or the outcomes that we look at in a study can be self-report measures or things like that. But in this case, this was an objective physical change that they were able to observe. And what they found was that there was sort of increased thickness of the outer layer of the brain, the cortex, um, in particular, and the anterior cingulate cortex. And so what it showed that part of the brain got a little thicker with meditation experience, and we can show that in a slightly different way. So in this case, you've got the thickness of the cortex, and then you've got the person's age, and the red dots would be the controls. And so what we tend to see with age is that you're going to get an age-related decline in the thickness of that cortex for all of us. But depending on how you draw the line for the meditators, seem to sort of be a flat line and sort of seem to, I guess, you wouldn't see as much of a reduction in the cortical thickening of that particular part of the brain, which tends to be involved in proprioception, so our ability to sense the body. So I think that's exciting because you think, well, if I can prevent my parts of my brain from getting smaller with age, that's a pretty good motivator to practice. All right, so let's get to the next part, which is why would we even use this, and try to come up with a little bit of an understanding of what that's about. Quite often we sort of can approach our mood states with the idea that we need to fix them or somehow problem solve them. Not that that's a bad thing. If it works, it's great. But quite often what happens with more of depression and anxiety is that we do try to think our way out of the problem through rumination or worry or overthinking, like, why do I feel this way, or judging myself for feeling this way, or what's going to happen if I keep feeling this way. So those kinds of things. And those are some of the specific thoughts that we might have when we're feeling those different things, anxiety or depression. But I think Jon Kabat-Zinn captured something quite eloquently in his book, Full Catastrophe Living, which is, basically we want to change things, we want to get rid of it, or we want to push it away. And so he says, of course, the natural tendency is to avoid feelings of pain whenever possible and to wall ourselves off from as much of it as we can, or to be automatically swept away by a tidal wave of feelings. In the end, the damage that is done when we deny or avoid our feelings or become lost in them only compounds our suffering, adds to our suffering. So this idea that we can start to, make some of our problems worse by trying to figure them out. Because often we get a little bit into a struggle with them. And if they don't go away, we just struggle more and more and more. So this is really what the doing mode of mind does. So this is the part that allows us to reason, plan, learn, and all those kinds of things. We use it a lot. It's really helpful. We've accomplished a lot in our lives because of it. And so, but when it gets to these, working with our emotional states, our mood states, maybe it's not so good. So basically what it does is the doing mode of mind has an idea. This is how it generally works with things. It sort of has an idea of where we want to be, has a sense of where we are, measures the gap, and tries to find a way to close that gap. And if it does, that's fantastic. However, first of all, we're going to say a few things about this doing mode of mind. It's sort of our default way of operating in the world. So we don't choose it. It just kind of is there automatically a lot of the times. It does use thinking. It's going to be crossing from the past into the future, all in service of trying to attain the goal. And so if you thought, I have a project, this is where I want to get to, and this is where I am, it's going to help you solve the problems and overcome the obstacles and get to where you want to go. It's all fantastic. Keeps in mind what to avoid. Like if I want to feel good, I shouldn't feel bad. So those kinds of things. And it really wants things to be different than they are. And like I said, it's always evaluating that gap between where things are and where we'd like them to be ideally. It buys into the thinking that is produced by the doing mode of mind. It thinks it has something it believes it has something important to say. One of the downsides sometimes, though, is that this goal-oriented way of being can be somewhat critical or harsh as well. So those are some of the downsides, but just to sort of orient us a little bit on this doing mode of mind. And so, like I say, it can be useful for great external problems, but it may not work well for these sort of internal states, getting rid of unwanted feelings, not being a certain kind of person. And so by keeping in mind the gap between the current and desired state, often if we can't move where we are, then it just highlights how much, we're falling short of where we want to be. And that often adds extra suffering. It's like, oh man, I still feel bad. And that's just, I'm always going to feel bad. So then there's hopelessness. So we add that to the mix. And then if we just double down on that, in terms of trying to avoid experiencing unhappiness at all costs, we can get quite driven around this. So I'll just share a little cartoon here. I don't know if you can see it, but we've got the cat here and everybody's in the yoga class. And my alignment is pathetic for downward facing dog. So where the like to be able to do the downward facing dog and doesn't work. So feeling kind of discouraged and depressed. So there we go. So then the question is, if we do have these mood states or these anxiety states, is there another way? So let's answer this question by actually starting with a little bit of an experiential exercise. So I'd like to guide you through a little practice. It's not so much a meditation per se, but it's a little practice, and we'll see what an opportunity for you to notice what your experience is while we do this. So just find yourself a comfortable position, whether you're sitting or lying or however you are at home, and making yourself as comfortable as possible right now. If you are seated, it could be feet flat on the floor, and then just your torso rising up from the foundation of your hips. And if you like, and you're comfortable with it, letting your eyes close gently. And if you prefer to keep them open, you can just let the gaze be soft and directed down towards the cheekbones. Okay, so let's begin. And I just want you to think a little bit about your feet. Maybe as I say that, an image of your feet comes up in your mind. That's fine. You may also think a little bit about judgments about your feet, whether you like your feet, don't like your feet, maybe want them to be different in some way. Maybe you end up remembering some of the places that your feet have taken you. You might also remember some problems you've had with your feet. So just thinking about the feet. Whether judging, remembering what you're going to do with them. Okay. So now we're just going to shift our attention a little bit, and we're going to let it drop down right into the feet. So we want to sense the feet as they are, whether they're on the floor or lying on a bed or whatever. We just want to sense what we're experiencing there. So noticing sensations, perhaps noticing some vibrations or maybe a sense of weight, heavy or light. Or maybe temperature, warm, cool. So sensing inside the feet as well as on the surface. We're not looking for anything, but just open to what it is we're experiencing in the feet right now. And so now I'll just invite you to scrunch your toes So draw them in and just sense what it is that you're experiencing now, whether it's in the toes themselves, the sole of the feet, the tops of the feet. Just aware of what's unfolding. And now just releasing the toes and noticing what you're experiencing now. Just moment by moment. And then when you're ready, just opening your eyes. Now, again, it's a bit hard to do this in a Zoom call, but just reflecting a little bit, maybe taking a moment to reflect or even making some notes about what you noticed when you were thinking about your feet in that experience. And so maybe noticing some of the thoughts that you had, and then also taking a few moments to reflect on what did you notice when you were just bringing your attention to the feet and what you were experiencing there. And then maybe reflecting on, were there any differences between the two ways of knowing your feet, thinking about them versus actually experiencing? So maybe to sort of try and capture a little bit of what you might have experienced. It's not uncommon that people would say that when they were thinking about the feet, it was more of an indirect way of knowing the feet. And perhaps people also noticed that once they started thinking about something, it kind of could really snowball and go places. Versus when we're actually sensing it, it's another way of knowing things. And in this case, it's kind of a direct, a knowing of our direct experience. We don't have to think so much. I mean, when we notice the feet, we could still trigger thoughts about it, but it's just a way of moving in closer to the actual feet themselves. And so that can be quite a bit of a difference. And that's a way of really connecting with direct experience. So let's talk about this other mode. So this is what we would call our mode of non-doing, or a mode of simply being, which is just simply being present with our experience. And we can sort of think a little bit about how it's different from our mode of doing. So in doing, it's quite automatic. We're often on automatic pilot. And versus in this being mode, it often offers us the opportunity to maybe consciously at least be aware of what's going on, and to be able to choose how we want to behave going forward, rather than just being swept along automatically, if that makes any sense. So we've talked a little bit about that difference about thinking about things versus directly experiencing. And quite often when we're directly experiencing, that's automatically means that we're in the moment, in the present moment, versus, dwelling in past or future. And it's a different way of being with our experience. It's an approach versus trying to change things, maybe fix things, just trying to make things a certain way. And so we're cultivating a way of just allowing things to be as they are, rather than needing things to be different. So we've stepped out of that kind of goal-oriented, I want it to be a certain way kind of mode. One of the things we tend to learn as we practice is that maybe the thoughts aren't necessarily real and true, but maybe they're just things that the mind produces automatically, quite often, habitually. And so less of a focus on a goal orientation, and maybe we learn a little bit more about what's needed in the moment. So that's a little bit of an answer to the question of just some ideas, but ultimately it really comes down to giving it a try and seeing what comes out of your own practice. So before we get into what is mindfulness, just checking with Patrick again if there's any questions about what I just talked about.
No questions, but there was a little bit of feedback.
Oh,
One person liked the meditation. Another one said they felt good about it than earlier. Another person said so many different thoughts, just relaxed when feeling my toes. My personal experience was that when I was scrunching my toes, my foot was about to cramp. And so that raised anxiety. And then when I let my toes relax, my mind also relaxed and got back into the state. Um, Somebody else says my feet needed a break. I hadn't paused long enough to realize they were quite sore, relaxing and serene. And then we have a question. Silly question, but is there a difference between mindfulness and grounding techniques?
ah,
That's an interesting one.
that's an interesting one. I just want to hopefully remember that question. I just want to say a couple things about what you were saying. Is that, yeah, the one person who said, wow, I didn't realize my feet were hurting and all that. And so getting back to this idea of, paying attention to our needs versus our goals, and by tuning into what our actual experience is, sometimes we get important information that's, that helps us to maybe better take care of ourselves. So that's one thing. It sounds like another person noticed kind of that cascade. I've got some sensations that are unpleasant, and then there's some thoughts about that. Oh, I might cramp up, and that creates some anxiety. So that's wonderful to bring awareness to something that normally would happen quite automatically. So some great noticing there. In terms of what's the difference between mindfulness and groundedness, that's a great question. And in many ways, I do want to guide us through a practice now that's going to be called, involves kind of finding our anchor or finding our ground. So grounding is quite often used to help people, uh, ground themselves in direct experience in the present moment. And so it's a part of it, but it's not everything for mindfulness. There's more to it than that. So let's do a little bit more of an actual practice, if that's okay. And so what I want to do is, it does, you know, it probably helps to take position that sort of embodies your intention to be present. Quite often we can, just be lying in bed or something like that. And that may be just more, we want our intention to just relax and zone out. But we want to support ourselves in a position that's going to allow us to also be alert and awake, because that's part of what we're doing. We're waking up to our experience. So ultimately, it's up to you what position you're going to choose, but let's say, and it can be done lying down as long as you feel like you're going to be alert enough. It's always challenging near the end of the day, but anyway, so finding a comfortable spot. If you are in a seated position, perhaps feet flat on the floor, hips tilted a little forward to create sort of that natural curvature in your lower back. Letting your head move a little closer to the ceiling just to lengthen out the spine. And it also helps to align the head, the neck, and the torso. Finding a comfortable place for your hands if that works, and allowing the eyes to close gently or letting the gaze be soft and directed down towards the cheekbones. If you're lying down, you could just lie with your legs straight, feet falling away from each other, your arms by your side, palms facing up towards the ceiling or the floor, depending on what's comfortable, and just allowing yourself to feel supported by the floor or the bed or whatever it might be. Huh. So, yeah, our intention for this short practice will be to just find our anchor. And so we'll begin by just tuning into a sense of the body sitting here. Just noticing what's present, what's here right now, however it is, just knowing it without needing to do anything about it. And so now we're just going to explore a few different spots in the body where we can perhaps anchor our attention. So the first one would be the feet. So just moving your attention down to the feet, sensing them as they are, moment by moment. So just knowing the experience of the feet as it unfolds. So perhaps sensing contact of the feet with the floor or the bed. Perhaps sensing vibration or stillness. And now, if you're okay with it, letting go of the feet as a focus of the attention. And now just bringing attention to where the body is making contact with whatever is supporting it. So if you're in a chair, perhaps the buttocks, the pelvis, the hips. Or if you're on the bed, just the whole body being supported, just so a sense of contact with what's supporting the body. Just paying attention to this contact, moment by moment. And now let's move our attention to the hands, wherever they are, whether in the lap or on by our sides. Perhaps noticing warm or cool, vibration or stillness, heavy or light. Not looking for anything, but just being open and really receiving what's here. Not so much thinking about it, but actually experiencing it. And now, letting go of the hands as a focus, let's tune into the breath. So picking a spot in the body where you can sense the breath. So it could be in the nostrils, could be the back of the throat, could be the chest, or it could be the abdomen. Just picking one spot where you're able to notice the changing sensations as the breath moves in and out. Perhaps witnessing the sensations of associated with the breath moving in, the out breath, and perhaps noticing a little stillness between the in-breath and the out-breath, and the out-breath and the in-breath. And of course, if at any time you notice that the attention, and this has probably happened already a few times, that the attention has moved away from your chosen anchor, just noticing where it's gone. No need to give yourself a hard time. This is really what the mind does. It's going to go check something else out. And then once you've noticed where it's gone, just gently bringing it back to your anchor, to the breath. And now, if you like, you can either stay with the breath or choose one of the other anchors as your preferred anchor right now. So it could be the feet, where your body makes contact with the support, or the hands, or the breath. There's no right or wrong answer, just whatever seems to resonate right now. And just sensing this anchor moment by moment. And perhaps recognizing that these anchors are always available to you throughout the day, and an invitation to perhaps check in with them at other times. And now over the next few moments, opening your eyes if they were closed, focusing your gaze if it was unfocused, and moving your body in any way that it might ask or need, stretching, etc. Okay. So a little taste of practice. Now, some of you may have found that your attention went to places other than where you were intending to pay attention. So I think that's captured a little bit in this cartoon. I realized I've only been at it for 5 minutes, but meditation isn't bringing me the peace of mind I was promised. And so I think one of the first things that we learn about our practice, and I was saying this a little earlier, is that minds tend to wander. And really, this is part of, what helps us practice. It's like if we went into a gym facility and there were no weights or machines, you kind of go, well, that's not a very good facility. I can't really get stronger. And so it's the same with the mind. If it doesn't go any places, first of all, you probably have bigger problems if if the mind isn't going places. But in general, part of what we're doing here is we're just practicing these little attentional arm curls. So each time the mind wanders, we get another repetition in. So it's perfectly normal. This is just the way the mind has evolved over the years. So what is mindfulness then? People were asking a little earlier. It means paying attention in a particular way. So, the conscious intention to what's happening in the present moment. And this is a really key, non-judgmentally. So with a sense of kindness and curiosity and openness. And so it's the quality of the attention that we bring to our experience as well that's important. And so this is just a definition that we've been using for years from Jon Kabat-Zinn. And so, one of the ways we could, or one of the labels we could use for the practice that we just did is just finding our ground. So finding an anchor. And so some of you may have found that, okay, so this was a little different. And we talked a bit about this in the first exercise as well. We can step out of our thinking and actually directly experience what's happening in the moment. And really what this shows us is that we've got our normal mode of just, whatever's going on normally, and quite often we're on automatic pilot, but we also have a choice. We can actually choose to cultivate this other mode, this mode of non-doing, this mode of being present. And quite often, we sometimes, when we do this, we get some new information, but that we didn't have. So earlier, someone was talking about, oh, my foot's sore. I didn't know that before. And also, it's an opportunity to sort of bring, some of those qualities of the attention I was talking about earlier. In this case, a sense of curiosity, a sense of, really as if we're seeing something for the very first time. And that's a way of cultivating the curiosity. Some of you may have noticed that your experience changed by being present, and some of you may not. I mean, and this isn't necessarily what we expect to happen. It's just what can happen. Sometimes we get a little more relaxed. Sometimes we might notice that we're restless. And that's just checking in. What we're doing here is we're just checking in on what our experience is. We're not trying to make it be a certain way. So that's a little bit about stepping out of automatic pilot and being present. There are a number of myths that have evolved about mindfulness meditation. First of all, I think quite often the most common one is that people think that they should be able to get rid of all their thoughts and have a blank mind. And that's just not going to happen. Trust me. That's not what minds do. But I think it's when we set the intention to pay attention to something against that backdrop, we get to notice more where the mind is going. And as I was talking earlier, where the mind goes is pretty important to be aware of, because without awareness, it just takes us where we want to go. It's a bit like driving a car. We've got this automatic pilot on the passenger seat. They reach over, grab the steering wheel, and the next thing we know, we're in the emotional ditch. And so what we're trying to do is become a little bit more aware of when that automatic pilot grabs our steering wheel, so that we can necessarily, and so that we might increase our chances that we stay out of the emotional ditch. So there's that. It's not necessarily, our intention isn't to become relaxed. And quite often I think people conflate meditation with relaxation. It's not that it can't happen, but we may also be tuning into the fact that we're restless that day or something else, or agitated, or whatever it might be. So we're not trying to have a certain type of experience. And that's really a function of the doing mode of mind, which wants to have a certain type of experience. We're not trying just to become detached from our experience. We're actually approaching it and moving into it. It's not a panacea or a quick fix. It's not going to cure everything, but it can be a helpful set of tools that we can rely on at times of distress. It doesn't always work in the way that we might want it to. So sometimes when I'm really upset, all I can do is just know that I'm really upset. And other times I'm able to work wisely with something, and it can actually be quite transformative. The nice thing about these mindfulness-based interventions is that they've sort of been secularized. So they've been stripped of the religious aspects, and sometimes that can make things a little more accessible for folks. And it's not about just positive thinking. It's really just getting to know just the habits of our mind, whatever they are, without sort of trying to have it be a certain way. So just to clarify some of those myths, let's talk a little bit about what mindfulness is. There's sort of a kind of two components to it. There's more of like a concentration or a focused attention, and that's a little bit about what we were just working on. So stepping out of the automatic pilot, directing our attention to, and let's say an anchor, and at least intending to have it there, doesn't mean it actually stays there. And then, so this is captured quite nicely in this cartoon, two monks sitting in the monastery. Are you not thinking what I'm not thinking? But again, don't want to reinforce that idea that we're having a calm or blank mind, because that's really not what it's about. It's about those attentional arm curls. We're practicing choosing where we want to put our attention and being aware of where our attention is going or being drawn to, which is different than just being on automatic pilot. And then there's a second component, which we can build once we've established some of this focused attention, and that's mindfulness or open monitoring. And that's able to pay attention to a wider range of objects. So it might be something as simple as walking through the forest, but noticing sounds, sights, the temperature on our skin, the feet walking, but just kind of moving around those wider range of objects. It does help us also, though, have a greater awareness of just how the mind works and how it creates suffering. So it leads to insights, and that's sometimes we describe mindfulness as an insight practice. And then once you've got those two building blocks established, which can take some time, then we can move on to creating some more adaptive states of mind, like the love and kindness and self-compassion, etc. So that's a little bit about the overall journey. I think I'm running out of time, so I won't be able to go into that. We can think of two types of practice. We did more of a formal practice when I was guiding it, but we can also think of informal practices, and that's just bringing attention to what our experience is when we just do routine daily activities. Nice thing about these ones, doesn't take any extra time. You're doing the activity anyways. You're just making a choice about where you're placing your attention. So for example, I would practice, paying attention to brushing my teeth in the mornings, and then I would notice, oh, the shoulders are really up. Hey, I'm really kind of tense and anxious. And then it's like, oh, that's interesting. What am I tense or anxious about? Oh, I'm worried about being late. Yeah, well, that's interesting. But wait a minute, I'm never late. So an opportunity to catch something that was just happening every morning and to bring some awareness to it. Yeah, so kind of switching out of that mode of doing and into the present moment. So getting more specific in terms of the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy group, um, this, as it was developed, it's sort of an 8-session program, roughly about 2 hours, sometimes a little longer, depending on the person. In its original version, there were 4 follow-up booster sessions over the course of the next year. And that's not always there in the MBCT groups these days, but there's going to be an opportunity to practice the meditations between the sessions. And so that practice, at least for the MBCT group, can be anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes a day, partly because we really, you've been practicing the mode of doing all your life, but we want to really get into the mode of non-doing. So that's the invitation. And usually it's done in groups of, well, it used to be when it was in person around 15. Sometimes there's capacity to do more now that we're sometimes online. So the course overall, the first 4 sessions are working on developing some of those skills I was talking about in terms of focused attention and getting a bit of a more in-depth knowledge of where the mind goes. And then the second half is really, what do I do with what I've become aware of? So working with things in different ways. That's sort of a brief description. I was talking earlier about formal and informal practices, just to flesh that out a bit. So we've got different practices. We did a little sort of finding our ground practice. There's things called body scan or mindful movement stretching, paying attention to our body as we engage in some gentle stretches. And this is where we're really paying attention and learning how the mind works quite often. But we also have the informal practice, which I was talking about. So paying attention to what we're doing throughout the day. And so I like this line from one of the retreat centers. Every day is a retreat, a silent retreat. It's just not as quiet, but always the opportunity to practice. So there we go. I do want to talk about one thing which I think is pretty important, and it's a real tension. So we often go to a treatment because we want to fix something or we want to change something. But as we were talking about earlier, that's really what the doing mode of mind wants. Makes sense to go and pursue that, but what we really need to do is we need to sort of let go of that in the practice in terms of trying to get somewhere with it. So I think that's captured a little bit in this cartoon. It's the meditation class, and on the flip chart, it says the journey to enlightenment. And one person says, are we there yet? So very much that goal oriented. But versus another, 2 monks sitting in the monastery again, one says to the other, nothing happens next, this is it. So that mode of non-doing, not trying to get somewhere. And when I work with people in the groups, I often ask them to sort of, as best you can, let go of this idea of, is it working for me during the course, and wait till the end to decide whether it's helpful or not. So that letting go of trying to get somewhere with it, and just, it's like planting a seed, and if you poke the seed every couple of minutes to see if it's growing, it doesn't really serve it very well. So give it an opportunity to germinate, come out of the ground, because quite often the seed, you won't see anything happen for the first few weeks or days or whatever it works out to. And so there is that similar process with the meditation quite often, but then eventually it does grow, and it comes above the ground and it grows into something, and maybe eventually it, will produce a flower or a fruit or a vegetable. And that's kind of what we're waiting for. So we need to have some patience whenever we start a practice. Stuff isn't going to happen right away. So there's that. So just a little bit as we start to wrap up, how to develop a practice. I like this cartoon, come on, inner peace, I don't have all day. So that's the opposite of having that patience. But so one way to help support you in establishing a practice can be taking an MBCT or an MBSR or even a deeper mindfulness course, whether it's online or in person. There's lots of books. I mentioned the Mindful Way workbook, but there's other ones out there too. There's local sitting groups. So one place to go to is the BC Insight Meditation Society, and they'll have a list of different sitting groups. It is probably somewhat Vancouver-centric, but there are farther afield, some sitting groups farther afield. I don't know if there's any still that are online, which happened quite a bit during COVID. You can go to a meditation retreat center and sit on a retreat for a day, 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. They're often conducted in silence, and they can be quite a powerful experience. So these are just some of the retreat centers. Spirit Rock is north of San Francisco. Insight Meditation is a little west of Boston, which is where John Kabat-Zinn kind of started his practice. There's a site called dharmaseed.org, which has thousands of Dharma talks, which is talking about meditation and or recorded meditations. And then more recently, we've got the apps. And certainly consistent with the tradition I've been talking about today would be 10% happier, just for what that's worth. If you want to take a course online, Zindel Siegel, one of the treatment developers, put together Mindful Noggin, which you can sort of, it's more of an asynchronous group experience. There's also actual online groups that you can do that are synchronous. Oops. And then for MBSR, there's Sounds True, where they have an MBSR program. And there's a correspondence course from the Insight Meditation Society with Joseph Goldstein, who's one of the more better known Insight meditation teachers. And that's available now through Amazon, apparently. So those are just some resources, not exhaustive list. And then I just thought I'd finish with this quote from Steve Jobs. If you just sit and observe, you'll see how restless your mind is. If you try to calm it, it only makes it worse. What you resist persists. But over time, it does calm. And when it does, there's room to hear more subtle things. That's when your intuition starts to blossom and you start to see things more clearly and to be in the present more. So just to leave you a little bit with that. And just to finish with one last cartoon, you have to learn to live in the now. Maybe next week, we're out of time. So my contact information, and I think that's about it. So I saved a little bit of time for questions or just sharing some comments that Patrick has been exposed to.
One person has a question here. So, and then I have a question as
Okay.
well to ask you. So I wonder if your research, the work that you've been doing, if you've come across client patient population for whom mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is not a good fit or is perhaps even contraindicated. That was going
Yeah,
to be
that's a
similar to my question too. So
yeah. No, that's a great question. Yeah, it's not for everyone. I mean, I got a couple aspects that I could speak to around that. So maybe contraindicated. For example, there's diagnosis out there called borderline personality disorder. And that wouldn't be a good fit for MBCT. Their capacity to sort of do the longer meditations usually isn't that great. And there is a mindful approach for treating borderline personality disorder, and that's called dialectical behavior therapy. It's based on Buddhist principles. And in that case, they've actually shortened the meditations quite a bit to about 5 minutes, because that seems to be a better fit for that particular group. So that would be one contraindication. For a while, certainly we're discouraging folks who had maybe a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And it wasn't everybody, but it was more that if people still hadn't moved very far in their journey of recovering from it, still experiencing flashbacks or capable of still experiencing flashbacks or re-experiencing, etc., and they hadn't sort of done some of that integration work to kind of just get it more stored as memories, that it could actually make things worse. At least that was the thinking. I don't know what the results of this PTSD study are going to be, because they actually worked with people who were, met those criteria. Now, there has also been a little bit of a push towards more trauma-sensitive kind of mindfulness-based interventions. And so a couple of the modifications there have been sort of what we did today in terms of, creating a wider range of anchors, because if something is triggering, breath can be triggering for people with panic disorder sometimes, or also for PTSD sometimes. So giving a range or options in terms of the anchors is one way, so you can find a place that's safer. But also we've incorporated this idea of, let's say, a window of tolerance. And often what we're invited to do in meditation is to turn towards our experience, but we need to have the capacity and the willingness to do that. And for some of our experiences, we're willing to do it. It's within our window of tolerance, and that's great. But some of our experiences are outside that window of tolerance. And then, um, that's sort of part of it is recognizing that. And that's what they were doing in the PTSD protocol, which is recognizing that and taking care of oneself in a way that they know how, if it was outside their window of tolerance, the level of distress. So those are a couple. Early on, even John Teasdale, for example, didn't want people who were acutely depressed to sort of do this program even. And his argument was this, that it might just allow them to practice ruminating more but better. Um, uh, as it turns out, though, the data has showed that it can be helpful for some. And so it's a bit of they still haven't done like a major randomized control trial for depression, but at least the smaller ones are consistent with it being helpful. And even for, like I said, treatment-resistant depression. So part of it is, yeah, you need to have sufficient motivation to do the practices. You need to make sure that you're not just going to ruminate and you're able to bring your attention back from that. So those are just some things to think about in terms of contraindications. Hopefully that answers that person's question.
Yeah. Does mindfulness-based cognitive therapy incorporate values and working towards value-based living to help with the being component?
That's a great question, and I'm wondering if it's coming from someone who is somewhat familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy, which is kind of based on mindfulness principles, but doesn't really have as much practice. But it also is incorporates a component on that values-based living. So we've got less of not really an emphasis on that per se. It really is more focused towards just reducing the risk of relapse. I'm just trying to think. It's a good question, and I'm trying to think if there is anything on the value-based side. No, nothing more explicitly in terms of determining the values, etc. In terms of our anchors, we can have, or our intended focus for attention, we can think of a continuum in terms of what's this, the strength of the sensations that are experienced. And, that can factor into our practices as well. Like when we are maybe more traumatized, or maybe when we're more restless, we want to go for an anchor that's a bit more strong. And then at other times, maybe we can go with something that's more subtle. So the breath tends to be more subtle. Um, Obviously moving on something like that, you're completely paying attention because, you want to maintain your balance. There's lots of sensations coming from different parts of your body. So it would be on the, that end of the continuum. In between, we've got things like, sounds, again, can be safer because they're external, but also they can be stronger if it's noisy around there. Could be eating, which again creates a lot of sensations. So just to introduce that idea of a continuum of what we might be intending to pay attention to, and and how that might support what our practice is at that time. So there you go.
Somebody says bilateral grounding is great for restlessness. Push your push your feet into the floor, left and then right, and so just sort of back and forth, so sort of stepping on the ground. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, so again, it comes down to different choices of anchors and what we're doing. And we tend to go with, I guess the other thing I didn't mention was just more of the movement practices are better when we're sort of restless or agitated, rather than maybe some of the more traditional sitting practices. And so this is kind of sort of in that direction in terms of creating a movement that's going to, generate stuff that's going to, be a little stronger in terms of sensations. In the deeper mindfulness program, they explicitly talk about, if you are more distressed, to go to the feet. In that case, they didn't mention, pushing them into the floor, but still that could be a safe place to ground your attention.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lau. It was great, and perhaps we'll run into each other sometime in person. So
there you go.